Alright, so hello one and all, welcome back to another Mushoku Tensei skipped content episode review thing. We are here with Season 2, Part 1, Episode 6. I'm here to tell you today that Fitz and Sylphy are not the same person, at least according to side story Sylphy at Part 1, that is. This is something that I wish that the anime had at least attempted to do, and I don't want to complain. Already, we're literally 2 seconds in. And technically the anime does cover the scene in episode 7, but in a bit of a less interesting way. Also, I forgot that this was a scene already adapted in episode 7, and I already wrote the script for this, and I'm not just skipping, I'm not going to waste it. So anyway, we go through a day in the life of Sylphy, whom we haven't seen in quite some time. Sylphy wakes up, gets changed, and grabs her hat, then checks up on the Princess Ariel, who's still sleeping. Sylphy gets up quite early to go on a jog throughout the city, but as she left the room, she said goodbye to Fitz, who sat in the room watching over Ariel. Sylphy wanted to run and push herself further each day and to memorize the street's layouts, all because she thought that that is something that Rudy would do. The layout of the city wasn't overly complicated, but it was honeycombed with many small alleys that Sylphy was unfamiliar with. And so she found an alley that she had never gone down before, and found out that it led from an area in the workshop district to an area in the commerce district. This time by the sun rose, which she loved because it was the only thing that remained constant in this world no matter where you were. She would normally be out of breath, but not today. She supposes that she'll just have to wake up earlier tomorrow so she can run even more tomorrow, so she is out of breath by the time the sun comes up. And so as Sylphy returned to the princess's bedroom, it was her task to get her ready for the day by changing her clothes. And today Ariel didn't really feel like wearing a bra. Side note, the bras that Ariel had are purchased from Asura through a place called the Remade Company in Sharia. Again, Nanahoshi's influence is crazy because if you didn't know, she owns Remate, and it's like even influential people like Ariel are using her stuff. She's got a lot of reach. Anyway, this gets Sylphy thinking about how even for elf standards, her chest is like really flat to the point where she doesn't even have to wear anything. Sylphy doesn't really like this at all and would absolutely be crushed if anyone were to accidentally mistake her for being a guy. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But more importantly, Ariel. During the teleportation incident, Ariel had saved Sylphy, and in return, she essentially became like her servant. It's not exactly like Sylphy disliked this or anything either. Sylphy would rather help someone else rather than help herself. However, one thing that was still a mystery to Sylphy was whether or not Ariel even liked her or not. Sylphy considered Ariel her best friend, but she doesn't think that she had ever seen Ariel give a true, genuine smile before. She even tells Ariel that she looks more natural when she doesn't smile, but Ariel laughs, which was probably a fake laugh, and says that Sylphy's probably the only person to ever say that to her. Because yeah, that is a weird thing to say just in general. But funny enough, Derek, Ariel's previous mage guardian before Fitz, had a similar relationship with Ariel. He thought that Ariel didn't like her, but as it turns out, she actually did. And it's likely the same situation here. But it's just that Ariel can't help but always have this mask on, very similar to Rudius in a way. After this, Sylphy and Ariel attended classes. For the most part, they taught things that Sylphy had already known, all thanks to Rudy. Even some of the more difficult classes recently, they had been teaching about combined magic. But even they didn't know why combining schools of magic did different things. Like, the teachers didn't even know. It's crazy. Why does this hot rock make this cold water warm? No idea, but it just happens. That's kind of like the idea around here. It happens. We don't need to think about it. Anyway, as the classes go on, Ariel sometimes asks Sylphy about questions about the subjects at hand. See, Ariel is interested in raising her status for the throne, but she's also genuinely interested in learning about magic, which Sylphy finds quite admirable. She respects people who are passionate about their studies, much like how Rudius is. Sylphy likes those who have high goals and want to accomplish something in life. She respects Ariel for that, but also a man named Fricht, a 46-year-old student at the school who is looking to become a teacher, and Sylphy found that admirable. In her next class, Practical Skills class, the oldest student was Fricht, who was a retired adventurer. He primarily focused on physical attacks despite being at a magic school, which the other students found frustrating, but Sylphy never did. It made sense to practice against all kinds of opponents. And the reason why someone like him is at the school is, one, Renoa Magic University is more like, it's more than just magic. But also, the more years you spend at the school, the more non-magic related courses you could take, primarily those that focus on trades. So there are students like Fricht who might not exactly be book smart, but they might excel at combat training or certain trades. The focus of practical skills classes to participate in mock battles. Fricht, much like Rudy, takes mock battles and practices very seriously, and so Sylphy tries to as well. Those who are experienced in combats at the older folks training at the school put thought into every move that they make, while with this new generation, while they may have new and fancy tricks, it's usually all that there is, right? Aside from that, the skill just doesn't compare. After classes, Sylphy was back to looking after Ariel. Today they were going shopping. However, both she and Fitz weren't wearing much fancy clothing today, and that's because that's the point of the shopping venture. Ariel didn't exactly have anything planned for today. There were sometimes days just to relax after a large group discussion, but those were very far and few between. What happened during a day for Ariel and her attendants were at the mercy of her whim. Although calling it a whim isn't exactly fair, her decisions were based after taking her attendants' mental states into account. Moving from Asura to Renoa had taken a toll on Luke, Fitz, and Sylphy. Fitz had something like a nervous breakdown, Sylphy was crushed to find that her parents were dead, and Luke was basically busy trying to figure out a way to make everyone not horribly depressed. These days off, which were actually suggested by Luke in the web novel, something I covered in my episode 0 video, it helps them. And specifically what they were shopping for today was lingerie and underwear, a shop that Sylphy felt pretty uncomfortable in. After their shopping trip, Sylphy introduced Ariel to the alleyway shortcut that she had found, and so they had taken that route back to school. Alleys like this, Luke said, were likely the remnants of the town from when it was first built. For context, Sharia was a very old city. When it was first built, it wasn't exactly like it was the way that it is today. Because Sharia in Renoa sits in between the borders of Basharans and Neris, it had a bit of a labyrinth layout, which would deter the possibility of an invasion. Ariel's surprised that Luke knew something like this, but it's not like he was paying attention in classes or anything, it was rather that he heard it from a girl he was on a date with recently. He is a man of the Notos household after all, he said. And that got Sylphy thinking. Notos. Rudy was a Notos, wasn't he? Both Luke and Paul were both massive womanizers. Well, Paul was cut short at 2, but if it weren't for Zenith's, Millis faith, she was sure that Paul would have up to 5 girls with him at once. Now, Sylphy isn't a follower of Millis exactly, but if she were married to Rudy, and if he were to bring home another woman, she would be afraid of that he would cut things off if she didn't accept this new woman, so Sylphy would be willing to compromise. But if we were to bring a second woman home, and now that there were 3 wives, well, Sylphy would just have to take the position as a mediator to keep them all from fighting, of course. And as much as she'd accept another, even 2 other wives, she would much rather have Rudy focus all of his love on her. But anyway, after Sylphy's daydreaming, they made their way back to their dorm rooms, and she stared at her bed, which had a matching pair of bra and panties. Sylphy doesn't exactly want to wear it, but after a discussion between Ariel and Fitz, they decided to get it for her. Ariel said that Sylphy needed sexier underwear. You never know when you might need it after all. Right now, Sylphy doesn't really have much ambition in life. Serving Ariel is all that she needs right now. However, making Rudius happy would probably be something that she'd want to do if she could. Then she went to bed and went to sleep. So, yeah, Fitz and Sylphy aren't the same person, or that's at least what the books want you to believe. I do think that it would have been really cool to do, though, in the anime. Fitz, just in general, actually, having Fitz as a separate person would have been a really cool development. I kind of like that idea. But anyway, in the book, there's a lot of metaphorical stuff going on with Fitz being there, waiting for Ariel while Sylphy goes off to train, right? That's the time that Sylphy gets to be by herself, while Fitz is there for Ariel. Right? I think you understand. I do wish that the anime had at least tried to take some time to adapt something like this, just as an attempt for the audience, because I think that would have been really cool. That would have added some mystery, because a lot of it felt very plain and flat from what I've heard of people that I know that I've watched season 2. And I do think that this would have kind of spiced things up just enough to make the season just a bit more interesting. Because that Fitz is Sylphy. Fitz is Sylphy, even if you read the books, that Fitz is Sylphy. It's a bit different in the web novels. It tries a lot harder to convince you, but at the end of the day, it isn't a big surprise. But the way that I worded it back in my season 1 episode 23 review is that it'd be if the story told you exactly what Zenith has been up to over the past 5 years. But it doesn't. We know where she is, but not anything further. There's that little semblance of mystery, and I think that would have made the anime a little bit less dry if they added in this mystery. Like, I'm fine with the anime, obviously have my complaints, but I watched it with someone who didn't read the books and they weren't exactly a fan, and they loved season 1. And they're not like against slice of life anime either. Their favorite show is Clannad, for God's sakes, but even they felt that it was too slow and felt like nothing happened. And so I do think that focusing more on side characters, expanding the plot there, as well as trying to convince that Sylphy isn't Fitz, would have spiced things up a little bit. But enough about that. Let's talk about what the anime actually starts to skip and adapt and whatever. I'm sorry. Anyway, now let's continue on. And so we get a day in the life of Rudius as he says that his workout routine is based off of Saitama's, except that he doesn't want to lose his hair, and so he has to push it even further beyond. And as he was working out, he did see a certain girl run by, but he couldn't tell who she was because of her hat. From there, the anime does a good job at explaining what Rudius does in his average day, but let me fill in the gaps. After his run, he does some magic training by crafting figurines. He hadn't done this in a long while, but still couldn't exactly concentrate because he's constantly hounded by Zenoba to teach him more, and soon he got dragged off to breakfast by him. The order of dining in the cafeteria was determined by academic year and social position, but they were kind of lenient on the time frames, mainly due to like how difficult it is to uphold. After eating, Rudius heads to the library to study teleportation until noon, where he'd reunite with Zenoba, who would ask Rudius tons of questions about things that he didn't understand in his classes. The only classes that he was taking was anything related to earth magic, but he was still working hard in his own ways, I suppose. And as the two would eat their meal outside, Alenalise would sometimes show up, but because she didn't see Zenoba as a good man, she didn't stay for long. And in regards to the types of food that the cafeteria served, the anime kinda said the opposite. It said that there were almost no Japanese-styled foods that catered to Rudius' palate, but that couldn't be further from the truth. One meal he notes in particular was the Nanahoshi Yaki, which was the world's variant of karage, as well as something similar to curry called kari soup. The point is, there is a lot of Japanese-style foods, albeit they aren't exact, to tease the eventual reveal that Nanahoshi is Seven, and Seven introduced all of these foods, and Nanahoshi obviously is Japanese, and so she would do all that, right? So it is weird how the anime said, nah, actually, the opposite is true. It's weird, I don't know. Could have been a mistranslation. Anyway, after that, Rudius took a class on healing magic, divine magic, and barrier magic. However, because of the law, the school wasn't allowed to teach anything above beginner tier magic in those fields. In fact, it was only just a couple years ago that they were even allowed to teach it at all. This is probably, again, thanks to Nanohoshi's influence, but that's just my speculation. Mainly because a lot of this magic is related to spell circles, which Nanahoshi focuses her research around. But why can't the school teach higher levels of this magic? Well, it's because the Millis continent won't allow it. Divine magic is their specialty, and they simply forbid anyone else to really teach it. Rudius does go over how each of these magic types work, though. We already know about healing, so he doesn't go over that. Divine magic is super effective against ghost-type creatures. Rudius figures that it was somewhat similar to Disturb magic, where you're using mana in its rawest form to strike your opponent. However, there had to be something more than that, since raw mana isn't enough to hurt anybody. He also says that it was taught that it's important to change the type of magic you use to counter your opponent, specifically referring to divine magic, implying that there are different types of divine magic. It doesn't make sense, there's different types of spells, so it makes sense that there's different kinds of divine spells as well. But what this means is that there is like a lot of different spells of divine magic. Like there's a lot of different kinds of it. Unlike where like with fire magic, all fire magic is fire, right? Not all divine magic is the same. And it's unfortunate because I don't think that we ever learn too much more about divine magic ever, right? I'm sure we do, but this is all that we know for now. There's just a bunch of different kinds, and they do very specific things, it seems. And something else that he found odd was that apparently first-rate sword fighters could just cut right through ghosts and destroy them like that, which I can kind of see the logic in that. If divine magic is using raw mana in a physical way, then that's very similar to Toki, which gives you a mana like armor essentially. So theoretically, Toki should be able to do the same kind of damage as divine magic, I suppose. Next up is barrier magic. This magic allows you to create walls to protect yourself. These were mainly constructed from magical circles, but you could also cast beginner tier spells through incantations. Magic Shield, a barrier spell, could isolate flames or cold and reduce their effect, as well as I assume block magic. The magic resistant bricks as well as the inn's fireplace were likely developed from this kind of magic. The same goes for I think Militian, where it was stated that because of its towers, weather just didn't affect the city. There's definitely some kind of barrier magic going on there. Since there's a magic shield, there's also a physical shield, but that's for intermediate tier, which means that the school wasn't allowed to teach it. The teacher, however, did know how to do it and could teach it, but they would get in trouble, like executed kind of trouble. Millis doesn't mess around. Obviously, we've seen that in the past. We'll see it again later. Millis does not hold back. Anyway, though, Saint tier and above can create shields that protect against both magic and physical attack. And looking back, Rudeus had to deal with a King tier barrier spell by Pax, and so he was able to, defend against both physical and magic attacks. Although now, Rudeus could probably destroy it. Anyway, after this class, Rudeus took back to the library and studied teleportation magic until it was dark. Because teleportation is a forbidden art, there wasn't really too much on the subject. After that, Rudeus returned to his dorm, ate dinner, worked on a figure a little bit more, and went to bed. And from there, we get the scene with Fitz and Rudeus, and it goes kind of word for word aside from some minor differences that are not really worth mentioning, and a couple things that are worth mentioning. The only thing that I'd like to go over is that it's stated that the teleportation events like the Fidoa teleportation incident have happened before in the past. Individuals have been randomly teleported and show up either back where they were sometime later or end up someplace else. However, none has ever been on the scale as the Fidoa incident. Also, they do bring up the break once in every 10 days like Luke had introduced, so I'm glad that they're keeping up with that, it's now canon. Lastly though, Fitz is impressed that Zenoba is so loyal to Rudeus since before Rudeus showed up, Zenoba always got into fights with the other students. It wasn't until Linny and Persenna had beat him, which is likely the event that the Roxy figure got smashed in, and he calmed down somewhat. And now with Rudeus here, he's like a loyal puppy. We do see a bit of a hierarchy in power here. Zenoba being the weakest, then Linny and Persenna being able to beat them, Fitz crushing them, and Rudeus being able to take down Fitz. And there are a couple problems with that, one of which is that Rudeus points out himself. He didn't really fight Fitz. He used Disturb, which cancelled out any kind of retaliation, and Fitz actually requested to learn Disturb from Rudeus. But anyway, that match doesn't prove that Rudeus is stronger, although he probably is. And when it comes to Zenoba, he's so resistant that not even a Saint or King tier swordsman can damage him, but he is somewhat less resilient to magic. Anyway, after this we get Rudeus teaching Zenoba figurines. It goes about the same in the anime, although it's implied that Rudeus had done more than just admire figures in the past. He could relate to Zenoba a bit more physically when it comes to the figures, I think you know what I'm saying, Plus we get the motives behind why Rudeus is teaching Zenoba all of this. And when it comes down to his money, Rudeus thinks that with the money and power that Zenoba has, which isn't exactly a lot, but it's still enough, that he can end up with mass producing figurines with color as well. He'd start off with Roxy figures, then move on to Ruijerd figures, and even write a book about Ruijerd and how he and his tribe had been misunderstood by the entire world in the struggles that he had faced. He'd sell the book with the free Ruijerd figure to come along with it, and if it becomes successful, he'd write a book about Roxy's achievements. We also get to know why Zenoba can make figures using magic, and it's for two main reasons. The first is that he needs to know silent spellcasting, which only 4 others Rudeus ever knew can do it. Orsted, Fitz, Sylphy, and the one professor that had recently passed away. There he is, being mentioned again though. So weird how much this guy is being brought up in the story. Who is he? But anyway, the second main reason is Zenoba's lack of mana. It's not that he necessarily had a crazy small pool, but he never practiced magic when he was a kid, and so he doesn't really have a lot. Plus, Rudeus just has a ridiculous amount of mana, so he can just do this casually. And although he's been told multiple times now that his mana rivals and possibly exceeds Laplace's, he only now realizes how much he has. I get that he's humble, but oh my god, dude. Rudeus is finally starting to learn that he is not just above average, he is just powerful. He is strong. It only took him 8 books now? God. Anyway, those are the 2 variables that stops Zenoba. And when it comes to crafting it by hand using a knife, which there are some magic knives that allow you to carve through boulders as though they're butter, it's Zenoba, after a while, Zenoba was able to make a figure, but it looked horrible. It's just because of his ridiculous strength. He can't control his hands that well. Zenoba had spent so long and so hard trying to do all of this that it was actually affecting his health pretty seriously. And so that's why Rudius turned to Fitz. Their conversation went mostly the same, except it was like kind of spread over a couple days, since Rudius had to first ask Zenoba if he wanted to buy a slave. Then he talked to Fitz about it once more, and that's when he asked to tag along. Slavery in this world is quite normal, and so long as you never really abused your slaves, no one had much of an issue with it. However, unlike in most of the central continent and Mills continent, in the northern territories, it was sometimes even endorsed to have a slave. The slave trade here was what kept some people alive by earning them money to survive. There are many reasons why one would become a slave. There were those orphaned in wars, those that were sold by their parents when they had no other options, and those who sold themselves to give money to their family. There was also rumor that there was a slave ranch within the darkest parts of the Thieves' Guild, which we don't know much about the Thieves' Guild, but this is, I believe, the second time that this has been brought up. It's interesting. Although it could have been brought up at season 1 at some point. I don't know when, though. But anyway, the three magic nations were generally well off enough so that their citizens never had to resort to such means, but there were a few places in the east where they weren't so lucky. Children bought from these villages were often recruited by the Northern Territories military or mercenary bands, which were bought by the government to serve as cannon fodder during a war. And the Asura kingdom had its own connections to the slave trade and brought only the most skilled and good-looking slaves. Since even those at the bottom of the economic chain in Asura didn't starve, even the slaves did decently well, although you obviously had to lose a lot if you did become a slave in Asura. Slaves in the north, however, were mostly hardy and talented, and many traveled all the way here to purchase them. So long as there were those selling people, there were others that will buy people. Before Rudius had headed out to purchase a slave, he found out that large cities had multiple slave markets, and Sharia itself had 5. You had the low-end markets where the markets would sell off slaves who were sick or even partially dying, and although there were bargains there, beginners like Rudius wouldn't know if they're being ripped off or not. And so they made their way to a more reputable market. Both Fitz and Zenoba were in awe of the building and compared it to the slave markets that they've seen before. It wasn't anything like this one. Most slave markets in the Northern Territories were held indoors for obvious reasons, because of the cold, and it had 8 stages of slaves lined up, and they were all naked and oiled as usual. Each stage seemed to represent a different shop, all of them owned by the Riem group, whoever they are. They run through the list of requirements for the slave. They had to be a dwarf for their dexterity, young enough to be able to increase their mana pool, and lastly, they had to be a cute girl. That was Rudius' suggestion anyway, and both Zenoba and Fitz scolded him. I mean, if Alenalise were there, she would agree with him. Actually, she would probably be... She's in a bit of a Shota phase, so I guess she'd probably want a boy, actually. But with all that in mind, they went to a clerk who immediately ignored Rudius and decided to talk to Zenoba, probably because he looked the most wealthy. After he cut Rudius off, Zenoba got mad, grabbed the man's face, lifted him up into the air as he demanded for him to not ignore his master. 2 guards stepped in and tried to take Zenoba down, but they couldn't even move him an inch. And as the guards came in extremely fast, Fitz had grabbed and aimed his wand at the guards, the speed of which was expected as the princess's personal guard. After that, Zenoba let the man go, and they were all directed to speak to a man named Febrito, who was the branch manager for the Domani store, the branch that they were buying the slave from. They met and spoke to Juliet just as they did in the anime, and it's fairly similar. The only things to note would be that Fitz finds the transition between going from Julius to Juliet funny for obvious reasons, I think, is, Sylphy, et, you get it. And also, she only cost about 10 Asura large copper coins. That's about 10,000 yen or 70 USD or about 90 CAD. Cheap as hell for a human being. And when they were naming Juliet, they went to this super fancy cafe that Rudius felt super out of place at. And in the light novel, her parents' names were Brazar of the Holy Steel and Litella of the Beautiful Snow Ridge, if I'm pronouncing those right, I don't know. But going back to when they met Juliet, the light novel goes into more detail of how much Rudius can relate to the despair in her eyes. But I wanted to shout out the manga more than anything. Back when I talked about Season 1, I had also included the manga in the skipped content, but the main reason why I dropped it in Season 2 is because it ultimately didn't matter. Nobody cares about the manga. I do. I like the manga. I think that it's good, and it gets a lot of hate for no reason because it genuinely does amazing scenes, really well. The dark scenes in the manga are way better than what the anime portrays it as, and sometimes it's even better than the light novel. Orsted, Paul, and these are the 3 scenes that I think the manga actually does best, better than any other adaptation or version of the story. Just looking at Juliet is terrifying, and the way that he says, do you want to die, is kind of just chilling. The manga does not get enough respect for bringing us scenes like this. I also love how he breaks her chain and holds Juliet in his arms, because like reading that, I'm like, yeah, no, that's what I would do. 100%. It feels so weird just to be like, yeah, no, I'll buy her. And then like, just, I don't know. It's such a good scene, such a good episode. I love Julie. She's great. And that is the end of the review. What did you think about all the skipped content? Again, I really like that manga scene. I know I'm here talking about the light novel, but I don't know, whatever. It's still technically, it's not skipped content, but it's just better content, I think. And I don't really have anything else to really comment on. I don't. Do you like my drip going on? Am I drippy? We got white on white on white on white. You know, it doesn't look too bad. I'm going with like a Norman from Promised Neverland, you know? With the cardigan, the button-up shirt. You know how it is. Okay, anyway, that's it. I'm done. Goodbye.